I would first like to thank the organizer of this workshop for the opportunity to present our joint work, which is part of an international initiative to synthesize extant research on response shift. And it is called the Response Shift in Sync Working Group. It consists of 4 teams, and I shall present today the work of Team 2. So we wanted to provide, it was a collaborative work, and we wanted to provide a critical examination of current responsive methods and to try to make some proposals for advancing new methods. First of all, we wanted to question our knowledge about response shift and what do we know today about response shift? Or maybe I should rather say, what do we think we know today? We also wanted to look at the disparities and the similarities of the methods because quite a large variety of response shift detection methods have been developed. And we may be wondering whether we are measuring the same thing with the same definition and operationalization, depending on the methods we're using, and whether we have the same alternative explanations for the inferred response shift effects. We also wanted to look at the gaps and to highlight what could be the important inherent limitations of the methods, and whether we could make some proposals for advancing new methods to try to move the field forward. So our primary objective was, first of all, to provide a critical examination of responsive methods. And we wanted to compare their implied definitions, as well as their different operationalizations. We also wanted to examine their underlying assumptions and look at their alternative explanations of the responsive results. And we wanted also to try to propose further developments of new methods that address some of the limitations of existing responsive methods and which are expected, hopefully, to advance the field. Our methodological approach was, first of all, to provide an inventory of the main methods that are used today. And we wanted also to see what definitions the methods were using. We wondered whether it was the working definition proposed by Sprangers and Schwartz as change in meaning of self-evaluation with target construct that result from recalibration, repartization, reconceptualization that has been presented by Carolyn, or whether methods were using the formal definition proposed by Franz Ort based on a discrepancy between observed and target change. And maybe some methods were using, in fact, both definitions. And we also looked at operationalization of response shifts depending on the different methods and whether the methods could detect, adjust, and or explain response shift. And we also examined their main assumptions, which were also compared, and their alternative explanations. That is, what if the detected response shift, the response shift that was detected was in fact not response shift, but maybe something else. We identified 11 different methods. For instance, so-called design methods, such as design test and appraisal, but also qualitative methods based, for instance, on semi-structured interviews, as well as individualized methods using specific instruments such as the SQL, or preference-based methods that can be based on vignettes, and also quite a few statistical methods, such as structural equation modeling, item response theory, relative importance analysis, or mixed models and growth mixture models, for instance. We have here a brief description of some of the methods, and we will talk about their definition, the definition they are using, and their operationalization. Regarding their description, we can say that, for instance, appraisal methods aims to infer response shift from change in cognitive appraisal, whereas qualitative methods aim to infer response shift from the verbalization of possible response shift effects by the respondents, while preference-based methods, for instance, aim to infer response shift by looking at change in ratings. And some of the statistical methods aim to infer response shift by looking at change in models parameters. For instance, when using structural equation modeling, when we're looking at change in intercepts or factor loadings. We could see that all methods were using the working definition, seem to be using the working definition proposed by Sprangers and Schwartz, albeit in an indirect manner, that is by inferring it from data. And we could also notice that not all methods used and operationalized the formal definition. Indeed, the methods indicated in green could make a distinction between observe and target change. And this discrepancy was operationalized in a different way, but these methods could, in fact, operationalize the formal definition proposed by Oort. While the methods indicated in red, and in that sense, some of the statistical methods were not making a clear distinction between observe and target change. And so they were not operationalizing the formal definition proposed by Oort. We could also see, and this was of course not a surprise, that all methods can detect, because they were in fact all aimed to do so, even though they cannot, all of them, detect all the different types of response shifts. That is, some methods can detect all types, like recalibration, reprioritization, and reconceptualization, like SEM, for instance. But some other methods are only able to detect one or two types of response shift. We could also see that about half of the statistical methods and the Venn test can adjust for the detected response shift, while other methods cannot do so. And we could also
Dann tauschen wir einfach, dann gehe ich wieder ins Schlafzimmer.
Sorry.
Casper, you need to mute yourself. Sorry, please continue.
Do I have to change something?
No, Casper had unmuted himself. So just please continue.
Okay, so I go on.
Please do, yes.
Okay, okay, fine. So we can see, yeah, that half of the statistical methods and the Venn test could adjust for the detected response shifts, and that all methods but appraisal seem to be able to explain response shift. We also looked at the assumptions, the main assumptions of the methods, as well as the alternative explanations of the detected response shift. And what we could see is that the ability to recall, indicated in red, was an important assumption of most of the methods. And also the ability to reflect on one's own quality of life, for instance, was something that was required from the appraisal methods, for instance, or qualitative methods, but also some individualist methods using the say-qual. And we could see, in addition, that the ability to verbalize on such reflections was also something that was required for qualitative methods. Regarding some important assumptions, we could also notice that most methods, except qualitative methods and individualized methods, assume that response shift is more or less homogeneous within a sample or a subsample. And it means that most methods assume that the majority of the sample shows response shift in the same domain and in the same direction. Of course, all methods are prone to alternative explanations, albeit different ones. And this is not a big surprise, as we can think about many influences that can indeed lead to the conclusion that response shift is present while it isn't, or vice versa. For instance, we can cite response bias, or using irrelevant stimuli when using, for instance, for interview questions, or also being faced with the issue of interrelation between different types of response shift when we use structural equation modeling or item response theory, for instance. What we could also see, and what our critical examination revealed, is that we have to really be cautious when we interpret result as response shift. And for instance, can we say that a discrepancy between observed and target change really equals response shift? Because it might be only a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And we think that extra steps really needs to be taken to exclude or make less plausible alternative explanations for this discrepancy. Also, we think it is important to really go beyond binary results that we sometimes see in some publication, just indicating whether response shift is present or absent. Because indeed, if we want to have a substantive interpretation of change, we really have to examine all the possible alternative explanations of the findings that we think of course, and also try to provide an interpretation and possible explanations of the response shift that we have detected. We also believe that if we want to move forward, we have to take into account an important thing, that is inter-individual variation. Because quite often, response shift is assumed to be homogeneous within a sample. But this might be a very restrictive and unrealistic assumption, because it is very likely that people give different responses to scale items because of many different causes, such as cultural differences, personality differences, or having different health experiences, for instance. So, in fact, response shift might very well be heterogeneous. Some methods have already been put forward and used and applied on empirical data, such as using latent trajectory analysis or using SEM, or also a combination of methods. Of course, these methods are not without some challenges. And for instance, the large sample size that may be required. Also, we can be faced with some restriction regarding the number of measured covariates that we can take into account. And sometimes for some methods, we have to make some a priori hypotheses on the source of heterogeneity, which is not always that simple. So further developments might be promising, such as extending the use of latent variable mixture models to longitudinal data, which is not, of course, without some challenges also, such as the computational resources that might be needed. And also when we use latent class models, we have to pay attention on how we interpret latent classes, which might not be always very trivial. Another way forward that we wanted to put forward was trying to see how we can handle multiple time points, because response shift is not always, but quite often restricted to two measurement occasion. That is, for instance, before and after a catalyst, but two static measures might maybe not provide a good overview of what is going on if we have more than two measures. Maybe it's, too bad to just use two. So possible methods have been also put forward and used, such as extending SEM to many measurement occasions, or using three-mode SEM, or also extending the use of item response theory or rash measurement theory to multiple time points. Of course, some challenges can again be put forward, such as the eternal challenge of sample size, And also the fact that some methods make some strong assumption regarding fixed interval between occasions, which is not always the case for some of our data. And we might, of course, when we have quite intensive longitudinal data, be faced with issues in model specification. So there might be further developments to be made and maybe promising approaches, such as using Bayesian joint growth models, or extending maybe the use of mixed methods. Of course, if we want to use a Bayesian framework, we have to make some assumptions regarding some a priori distributions, which might not be always so easy to do. And in a more general, from a more general viewpoint, if we want to handle multiple time points and work on response shift with multiple time points, we have maybe to think also on how we will interpret the response shift trajectories that we might obtain. And this might be something to try to think about, which might not be so obvious, I think. So, as expected, we could see that no single response shift method is, of course, optimal in all situations. And the key message of this critical examination is that response shift results should not be taken for granted. We have to make extra steps, and extra steps are really required to make response shift interpretation plausible. We also think that some promising avenues could be interesting, such as advancing new methods. And also we really believe that conducting more computer simulation studies could be of value to assess and compare the performance of methods. And it could maybe provide a great addition to the field. Thank you very much. I'm finished. Thank you for your attention.